Welcome back to World News Alert. We begin with urgent reports from Eastern Europe, where leaders are gathering for an emergency summit on the escalating crisis.
The first warning did not come with sirens. It came as 8 small contacts sliding through the clutter at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, moving faster than the fishing traffic around them and far more directly than anything that belonged that close to a U.S. carrier. On the bridge and in the combat information spaces around USS Abraham Lincoln, the picture changed in seconds. The boats were closing, the waterway was narrow, civilian traffic was everywhere, and from the moment their course became clear, the helicopters on alert had less than 7 minutes to get airborne before a fast, crowded transit risked turning into a crisis no one could control. So when Abraham Lincoln entered those waters, it did not move alone and it did not move casually. A carrier that size never does. Destroyers and cruisers would normally push outward as a defensive screen. Lookouts would be doubled. Electronic watch teams would be listening for shifts in local traffic and military emissions. Air crews would already be closer to their aircraft than normal because the first problem in Hormuz is not usually a missile. It is ambiguity. A small boat can be a patrol craft, a smuggler, a fisherman, a camera platform, or the opening movie in a swarm. At long range, that uncertainty protects it. At short range, that same uncertainty can kill people. The 8 boats used that gap exactly the way the Revolutionary Guard Navy has trained for years. They did not approach in a neat formation. They spread. Some hugged the background of commercial traffic. Some crossed at angles that complicated automatic tracking. One appeared to lag, each which mattered because a staggered approach forces defenders to keep asking the same question again and again. Which contact is the real threat and which one is trying to pull your eyes away from it? In a clean ocean picture, that question is manageable. In the Strait of Hormuz, with island chains, coastal clutter, heat haze, and merchant traffic all compressing the battle space, it gets harder with every mile. The boats were still outside the point where weapons had to be used, but they were already inside the point where delay became dangerous. Large warships do not pivot like patrol craft. A Nimitz-class carrier can make speed, but in a narrow transit lane, it cannot improvise wildly without endangering the ships around it, the escorts screening it, and the commercial vessels sharing the water. That means a swarm does not need to sink a carrier to achieve something meaningful. It only needs to force confusion, create a near miss, provoke an overreaction, or capture images of the world's most visible navy getting crowded in a place where the margin for error is almost nothing. On Abraham Lincoln, the crews responsible for air response would have understood that every second lost on deck would have to be regained in the air. Helicopters were the right answer precisely because the surface picture was too crowded to trust alone. From altitude, even a few hundred feet, crews can sort intent faster than shipboard sensors staring across sea glare. They can identify spacing between boats, detect whether crews are manning weapons, and most importantly, put a visible, mobile layer of force between a carrier and anything trying to rush it. But helicopters do not teleport, rotors have to turn, aircraft have to launch into wind, pilots have to clear the deck safely on a moving ship surrounded by steel antennas and tension. 7 minutes is enough time for professionals. It is not enough time for hesitation. That distinction matters. In a major war, commanders can sometimes accept noise, friction, and even minor procedural delays. In Hormuz, against fast boats closing in broken water, a minute disappears almost instantly. A craft making 40 knots covers more than 1,000 yards every 90 seconds. If several boats are already converging from different bearings, the geometry tightens faster than intuition suggests. What looks manageable on a display can feel uncomfortably close by the time a human eye gets outside and judges the actual closure. That is why the helicopters mattered more than their weapons alone. An armed surface boat can still gamble with range and clutter. A helicopter overhead strips away some of that freedom. From above, crews can see whether the boats are coordinating by spacing, not just by radio. They can watch for the one hull that stays outside the group to act as a spotter or decoy. They can spot heavy wake patterns that reveal acceleration before it becomes obvious from shipboard radar. They can also impose a psychological effect that small craft crews understand immediately. Once the aircraft arrives, they are no longer playing against the horizon. They are being watched in real time from a position they cannot crowd. Even so, the response window stayed narrow because the defenders were trapped by their own rules. American crews in congested waterways do not open fire because something feels wrong. They need hostile act or hostile intent that is visible, defensible, and reportable later to commanders, allies, and the rest of the world. That legal and political burden is not a weakness in theory, but inside a 7-minute window, it creates real pressure. The boats know the United States must be sure. The United States knows the boats know it. That mutual awareness is what makes a close intercept in Hormuz so dangerous. Both sides are maneuvering inside each other's restraint. As the helicopters climbed out over the water, the tactical picture would have sharpened fast. What had been 8 contacts on a screen became 8 distinct problems. Some boats were likely armed only lightly, if at all. Some may have been carrying heavier machine guns or rockets. 1 or 2 may have simply been there to record the encounter and push the footage through Iranian media channels within hours. That mix is not accidental, and it forces the Americans to treat the group as potentially dangerous without granting the certainty that would make a first strike legally clean. Every second the boats kept closing, they were trying to win that ambiguity fight. The helicopters changed the balance by shortening that uncertainty. Crews overhead can issue warnings on radio and loud hailer, mark dangerous approach lines, and use presence before force. If the boats kept pressing, the next rung could be visual warning measures, then warning shots placed where they are unmistakable but still controlled. Only after that does the latter turn lethal, and even then, target choice matters. The goal is not spectacle. The goal is to stop the lead threat, break group cohesion, and make the others decide whether they are willing to die for a maneuver that may have started as theater. What made this encounter especially tense was the geometry around the carrier itself. Abraham Lincoln is enormous, but size is not the same as freedom. In constricted waters, a ship that large depends on layers: outer surveillance, escort screening, air cover, clear communications, disciplined timing. If one layer is late, the next layer has less room to work. If several boats can push through to very short range, even unarmed hulls become a danger. A small craft crossing directly ahead can force course changes. One cutting across the bow of an escort can create collision risk. Another trailing near the wake can test whether crews are willing to escalate against a target that has not yet fired. This is how pressure compounds without a missile ever leaving a rail. By the time the helicopters reached useful position, the incident had likely compressed into a matter of yards, not miles. The crews above would not be looking at a cinematic battlefield. They would be looking at flashes of detail, boat crews standing or crouched, wake angles changing, one craft pushing slightly harder than the others, another drifting just enough to make the formation feel less random than it first appeared. From there, intent is read through behavior. Are they matching the carrier's transit while staying just outside danger lines? No. Are they converging on an escort to split attention? Is one boat testing how close it can get before a warning becomes force? In near-crisis moments, tiny movements answer big questions. If the boats ignored repeated warnings, The Americans had to show unmistakably that the next step was real. That is where helicopter precision becomes decisive. Armed Seahawks can deliver controlled fire against small surface targets in ways that are faster to position than larger fixed-wing aircraft and less constrained than shipboard guns trying to track across a crowded maritime background. But the crews would still have been thinking hard about backdrop, ricochet, civilian traffic, and escalation. In a narrow strait, every trigger pull must solve more problems than it creates. A bad shot could hit the wrong hull, start a fire among neutral traffic, or hand Tehran the exact propaganda victory it wanted. This is where 7 minutes becomes the whole story. Not because the helicopters were performing miracles, but because the boats were trying to force a choice before the full American defensive system could settle. A swarm works by collapsing decision time. It bets that a defender facing many small, fast, ambiguous targets will either freeze for a moment too long or react so hard that the political damage rivals the tactical gain. That is the knife edge in the strait. The speedboats were not just racing toward steel, they were racing toward a decision. Once that decision came, the encounter would have turned quickly. A helicopter dipping low off the group's flank changes sea state for small boats all by itself. Rotor wash, noise, and the sight picture of an armed aircraft overhead can crack the confidence that makes swarm tactics work. If warning shots followed and one lead craft still held course, then the aircrew's aim point would narrow to what mattered most. Stop the boat, stop it now, and keep the others from believing they still own the initiative. One disabled engine, one sudden loss of momentum, one boat shearing off at the wrong angle, and the whole formation can start to unravel. That unraveling is often the real victory. Swarm tactics rely on collective nerve. Each crew needs to believe the others will keep pressing. The moment one boat breaks sharply away, another slows, and a third loses spacing, the psychological shape of the threat changes. Now, the Americans are no longer facing a coordinated wall of pressure. They are facing individual crews making survival decisions under observation. Some may still posture, some may swing wide to preserve dignity and film the encounter from distance. Some may keep probing just far enough to claim they were never driven off. But the center of the crisis begins to move away from the carrier. That does not mean the danger disappears. In fact, aftermath can be one of the most volatile phases. A damaged boat in the water raises rescue questions. Iranian shore-based systems may light up to signal that the wider network is watching. U.S. escorts have to keep scanning for second-wave craft, drones, or coastal missiles exploiting the distraction. Commanders must report what happened while still maneuvering through the strait. Every radio call is now part tactical update, part legal record, part strategic messaging. One wrong phrase can harden the story before the evidence is even sorted. For Iran, even an unsuccessful close approach can still serve a purpose. It tests reaction times. It measures how quickly helicopters launch, how escorts reposition, how aggressively warnings are delivered, and where American commanders seem most cautious. That data matters, so do the images. Grainy footage of speedboats near a U.S. carrier can be framed domestically as defiance, even if the boats turned away under pressure. For Washington, the burden is heavier. It has to prove control without looking reckless, resolve without looking eager, and precision without pretending that crowded maritime brinkmanship can ever be made perfectly safe. Because if a carrier can be crowded here, captains notice, energy markets notice, allies notice, and every militia or naval commander studying American restraint notices too. A local harassment run becomes a regional signal. That is how a few fiberglass hulls operating for minutes can shift calculations beyond the strait. That is why the deeper meaning of this incident sits far beyond 8 small hulls and 7 urgent minutes. The Strait of Hormuz is not just water. It is a test chamber for credibility. A carrier passing through there carries more than aircraft and sailors. It carries assumptions about freedom of navigation, alliance reassurance, oil market stability, and the belief that the United States can absorb harassment without losing composure. Iran understands that the fastest way to challenge those assumptions is not always with a major strike. Sometimes it is with a swarm designed to push right up to the line and dare the other side to define where that line really is. And that is why encounters like this are remembered even when they stop short of open battle. They reveal how modern crises really work, not as clean duels between obvious enemies, but as compressed tests of discipline, perception, and nerve. The side that wins is not always the one with the bigger deck or the faster boat. It is the one that can see clearly first, decide under pressure, and act with just enough force to end the problem without creating a larger one. In the Strait of Hormuz, 8 Iranian speedboats tried to make the world's most powerful navy react on their clock. For 7 minutes, the margin was painfully thin. Then the helicopters arrived, and the question stopped being how close the boats could get. It became whether they were ready to keep coming once the line above them started looking back.